Everyone knows what an Aussie is. You hear the word in airports, on television, at international sporting events, and wherever Australians gather far from home. It appears on shirts, products, advertisements, and souvenirs. It is shouted proudly from packed stadiums. It sounds like the easiest nickname in the world to explain. Shorten Australian, add a friendly ending, and the mystery is over. Except it is not. The historical trail leads back to a time when Australia was still discovering what kind of nation it wanted to become. The word gained its deepest power thousands of kilometers from home, among soldiers enduring the terror of the First World War. Stranger still, in one of its earliest recorded uses, Aussie did not mean an Australian person. It meant Australia itself. So who first said it? Why is it written Aussie but pronounced Ozzie? And how did one casual abbreviation become a name recognized around the world? At first, the answer appears obvious. Aussie comes from Australian, but that only explains how the word was constructed. It does not explain why it survived while countless other nicknames disappeared. Today, Aussie can describe a person, an accent, a product, a sporting team, the Australian dollar, or almost anything connected to Australia. Yet it remains different from the word Australian. Australian is official. It belongs on passports, government documents, and international agreements. Aussie feels personal. It sounds like something said between friends. Somehow, 5 letters turned a formal nationality into something familiar. But before there could be an Aussie, there had to be a place called Australia. And that name has its own strange history. Centuries ago, European mapmakers believed a vast, unknown continent must exist somewhere in the southern part of the world. They called this imagined land Terra Australis, Latin for southern land. They had not mapped the continent, but they were convinced it was there. Later, parts of the land became known to Europeans as New Holland. Then the explorer Matthew Flinders strongly promoted the name Australia. Over time, Australia replaced New Holland and became the established European name for the continent. But that was only the European story. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had lived across the continent for tens of thousands of years. They already had their own nations, languages, boundaries, and names for the lands around them. The word Australia was a recent layer placed over a much older human world. Then, in 1901, 6 British colonies joined together to form the Commonwealth of Australia. On paper, a new nation had appeared. But inside the minds of many people, Australian identity was still complicated. Australia had its own parliament, but it remained part of the British Empire. Many Australians still thought of Britain as home, even if they had never seen it. British customs, institutions, and loyalties shaped public life. Australia had become a nation legally, but emotionally, it was still searching for a voice of its own. That is where language began to matter. Australians developed a remarkable habit of cutting long words down and giving them friendlier endings. Breakfast became brekkie. Barbecue became Barbie. Mosquito became Motzi. Relative became Relai. Tradesperson became Tradai. Afternoon became Arvo. Australian followed the same pattern. The beginning of the word was taken, and the familiar "ie" ending was added. Australian became Aussie. It was simple, playful, and easy to say. But the "I" ending did more than shorten the word. It changed how the word felt. Some people have claimed Australian shortened words because they are lazy speakers. But that explanation does not hold up. Some Australian nicknames are almost as long as the original word. Others actually add sounds instead of saving them. The real power of these shortened words is emotional. They make conversations feel informal and relaxed. They remove distance between people. They can turn a stranger into someone who feels familiar. Calling someone an Australian identifies their nationality. Calling them an Aussie can suggest warmth, humor, and belonging. But knowing how the word was formed still leaves us with the most important question. Who said it first? This is where the evidence becomes frustrating. Slang, is usually spoken long before anyone writes it down. A worker might use a new word at a railway camp. A sailor might say it aboard a ship. A family might repeat it around a dinner table. Years can pass before that word appears in a newspaper, diary, or book. That means the earliest written example is rarely the moment a word was born. It is simply the oldest surviving footprint we have found. No confirmed individual can be crowned the inventor of Aussie. Even major dictionaries present slightly different starting points. The Oxford English Dictionary has evidence from before 1910, while examples highlighted by the Australian National Dictionary Centre appear around the First World War. And those early examples contain a surprise. An account describing events in 1915 mentions a farewell dance for men who were going home to Aussie. In that sentence, Aussie meant Australia, the homeland waiting on the other side of the world. A 1916 example refers to an Aussie officer. Then, in 1917, an Australian newspaper records someone receiving something from an Aussie. By that point, the word clearly meant an Australian person. Within only a few years, Aussie could mean the country, describe something Australian, or identify an individual. But why do so many surviving examples come from the years of war? Because in 1914, Australia entered a conflict that would test its young identity in horrifying ways. The Australian Federation was only 13 years old when the First World War began. Thousands of men left farms, towns, mines, and growing cities to serve overseas. They traveled farther from home than many had ever imagined. They fought in the Middle East and across Europe. They stood beside British, New Zealand, French, American, Canadian, and other Allied forces. In those foreign places, surrounded by unfamiliar voices, being Australian suddenly became more noticeable. At home, a man might have identified strongly with Victoria, Queensland, Tasmania, or New South Wales. Overseas, those regional differences became smaller. To everyone around him, he was Australian, or increasingly an Aussie. Life at the front was not the heroic adventure many recruits had imagined. Soldiers faced mud, freezing rain, disease, lice, rats, deafening artillery, and the constant possibility of death. Friends could disappear in seconds. Letters from home might take weeks to arrive. Some men feared they would never see Australia again. In that world, language became a kind of shelter. Australian soldiers used humor to survive moments that were almost impossible to describe. They developed and repeated words such as digger, cobber, furphy, and dinkum. Their slang helped them recognize one another and preserve a small piece of home. Aussie was only 2 syllables, but in a foreign battlefield, it could carry an entire continent inside it. Then, in January 1918, the word appeared in a form that would help change its future. Lieutenant Philip Lawrence Harris was an Australian soldier and former journalist. He believed the troops needed a publication of their own, something written in their language and filled with their experiences. On the 18th of January, in the French village of Fletter, the first issue of a magazine was printed near the Western Front. Its name was simply Aussie. It was not produced in a comfortable newspaper office. Harris and his helpers had to work with limited equipment while the war continued around them. Machinery was difficult to find. Paper was precious. Parts of the printing operation had to be assembled under conditions that could have ended the entire project. Harris searched through damaged areas for usable printing equipment and supplies. At one point, a damaged machine was recovered from the ruins at Dunkirk and brought back into service. Paper was gathered from abandoned and destroyed printing works. The first issue of Aussie, the Australian Soldiers magazine, had a print run of about 10,000 copies. That was impressive, but demand quickly grew. The magazine contained stories, cartoons, jokes, poems, observations, and pieces of military life written largely by the soldiers themselves. It gave them permission to laugh at authority, complain about conditions, remember home, and recognize their own experiences on the page. Eventually, As many as 100,000 copies of an issue were produced. Think about that for a moment. In a landscape scarred by explosions, Australians were printing a magazine named after themselves. While nations fought over territory, these soldiers were quietly defining who they believed they were. The magazine almost certainly did not invent the word Aussie. The word was already being used, but the publication gave it visibility, personality, and emotional force. Its title said something important. These were not simply colonial troops sent from a distant part of the British Empire. They had their own humor, stories, accent, and way of looking at the world. They were Aussies. And here lies the darker truth behind this cheerful nickname. One of the warmest words associated with Australia gained much of its power during one of the most destructive events in human history. The nickname many people now connect with sunshine, beaches, sport, and relaxed friendship carries an echo of muddy trenches and men desperate to remember home. When the war ended, the word returned to Australia with the soldiers who had survived. The magazine also came home. Aussie continued as a civilian publication, keeping much of the humor and character of its wartime version. By the middle of the 1920s, its circulation had reportedly reached around 100,000. The word moved deeper into everyday Australian life. It appeared in newspapers, entertainment, sport, advertising, and ordinary conversation. Australians used it about themselves, and foreigners adopted it as an easy, memorable name for Australians. But the meaning of Aussie was also beginning to harden into a stereotype. For years, the imagined typical Aussie was often presented as a white male soldier, bushworker, sportsman, or larrikin. He was supposedly tough, humorous, independent, suspicious of authority, and loyal to his mates. That image was powerful, but it never represented everyone. It often pushed Aboriginal people, women, immigrants, city workers, and many other Australians to the edge of the national story. The word sounded inclusive, but the picture attached to it could be narrow. Over time, Australia changed, and Aussie had to change with it. Yet another mystery remained. Why is Aussie normally pronounced with a Z sound? And where did Oz, the nickname for Australia, come from? The standard spelling is Aussie, but it is commonly pronounced like Aussie. That pronunciation eventually produced spellings such as Ozzie and the shorter form Oz. Many people assume Australia became known as Oz because of the Wizard of Oz. The timing makes that story sound believable, but the evidence points elsewhere. An early form written as OSS appeared in 1908, long before the famous 1939 film made the magical land of Oz known around the world. The later spelling Oz may have been influenced by the film, but the sound was already connected to Australia, Australian, and Aussie. The first known example of Oz, clearly meaning Australia, appeared in a 1944 military newsletter. Once again, Australian soldiers helped carry a national nickname into wider use. Today, being an Aussie does not depend on having one particular ancestry, appearance, religion, or family history. Australia is home to people whose ancestors have lived there since the beginning of human memory. People descended from convicts and settlers, and people whose families arrived from every part of the world. Some embrace the word Aussie proudly. Others prefer Australian. Many also carry cultural, regional, and indigenous identities that cannot be compressed into one nickname. That is the final revelation. Aussie has never had one fixed meaning. It has traveled from casual slang to wartime identity, from magazine title to international nickname, changing whenever Australia itself changed. So why are Australians called Aussies? The simple answer is that Australian English shortened Australian and added the familiar ending. But the real answer is much deeper. The word survived because it gave a young nation something it needed. It sounded friendly instead of official. It distinguished Australians when they were far from home. It carried humor through fear, familiarity through distance, and belonging through uncertainty. No single person is known to have invented it. It did not simply come from the Wizard of Oz. And in some of its earliest recorded uses, Aussie meant not just a person, but Australia itself. Australian became the nation's official identity. Aussie became the name that felt personal. So when you hear the word Aussie, what does it mean to you? Is it simply a nationality, or does it describe a particular attitude and sense of belonging? And if you're from Australia, do you normally call yourself Australian or Aussie? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden history behind this familiar word, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we reveal more forgotten stories about Australia, its people, and the identity they created.